The people out there churning out AI-generated slopaganda think you're stupid. And that should make you mad. This 404 media story that takes you inside the sordid world of content farms pushing AI-generated pro-ICE propaganda examines a Meta account called USA Journey 897, which relentlessly posts AI-generated, pro-ICE, anti-immigrant slop videos, some of which get millions of likes to a disturbingly appreciative audience. But the people behind USA Journey 897 don't seem to be actual culture warriors with any real investment in U.S. immigration. Before they started showing ICE content, they used to show things like AI-generated videos of super jacked guys riding tigers, and a YouTube channel linked to the account shows videos on how to make money doing DoorDash. They have another Instagram account, which appears to be mostly AI-generated videos of boats exploding, and a second Facebook account, which is mostly, quote, stolen images of women with gigantic breasts and creep shots of female athletes. And I'm sorry, I didn't get any screen grabs of that. So, if they don't really care about US immigration, why are they doing it? The short answer is money. X and Meta pay out on a sliding scale. The amount you get is based on how valuable they think your audience is. And the most valuable audience to reach, according to social media, is the American audience. If these content creators are going to make money, they need to absolutely grind, which is why these creators rely so heavily on bots and generative AI. On top of that, the competition for those valuable American eyeballs is fierce. In order to make your content stand out, your hot takes need to be hotter, your racism needs to be more racist, and your videos need to be more brutal and aggressive than the next guy's. If you want to get a taste of the kind of brutality I'm talking about, check out the 404 Media article I mentioned above. I will link to it in the show notes. Spoiler alert, it's gonna ruin your day. This is content created without care, without craft, and without concern for what it's doing to us. It exists only to push our buttons, which are big and red and easily pushed, just so they can make some money. How much money? Between 1 and 2 cents per view. We sell our attention so cheaply. They purchase our anger for pennies. When you engage with this material, or heaven forbid you share it, you're not supporting your glorious cause. You're not supporting your community. You're supporting some dude in Rawalpindi who watched a 15-minute tutorial called How to Get Americans to Click on Your Video, which, by the way, is now an entire genre on YouTube. So please, stop following these accounts and learn how and why this content pushes your buttons so that your buttons get harder to push.